Again, yes. Again, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Ryan. And I want to thank you and Dr. Ince for all the work that you have done in putting this together. And it is always a little surreal to be able to see a former student doing amazing things. And it's always exciting and really appreciate you bringing us some of the BFS contributors to University of Washington. And looking forward to the conversation that will happen after this. And having done multiple of these, I will say it's always different. So that's what's really exciting to me. So I just want to also thank my co-editor, Whitney Purtle, and our two editorial assistants, Tashelle Wright, who I just saw enter the room. Actually, that's Dr. Tashelle Wright. And as of a couple of days ago, Yasmin Keleke, who is now Dr. Keleke, because they were so integral to this project, moving from just a simple conversation at Association of Black Sociologists to this volume that is amazing, if I do say so myself. And I want to make sure that talk a little bit about the origins of this. Certainly some of you in the audience have read this, but plenty of you, it will be the first time you're hearing about it. And there's a lot of ways that edited volumes can be brought together, but this one was special. And I'm not joking when I say that it started with a conversation at ABS, Association for Black Sociologists, in 2019 at the Philadelphia meetings. There's a little bit more to it, but let's just say that I went to that ABS and ASA conference with the intention of sort of broadening community and really thinking about what sort of contributions I wanted to make in the academy, even more so than I had before. And there was a group of us going to a restaurant, a jazz music place and restaurant. And it was an amazing group of 12 Black women who largely didn't know each other, but we also recognized sort of how unusual it was that we were all in the same space together. And I remember thinking, it was right after New Black Sociologists had come out with that edited volume from ABS. And I thought, wow, where's the equivalent? We're thinking about sort of Black feminist approaches to sociology, because I had read the one in anthropology. There's one called Black Feminist Anthropology. Black feminist archaeology had come out. I mean, there was a whole set of things. And I was like, is it the case that we actually don't have this in sociology? And I was like, no, I just have to have missed it somehow. And it was like, no, there actually hasn't been one. And posed the question to some folks, like, would anybody be interested? And Whitney actually said yes. And then we followed up. And at that point, ABS had already sort of developed some relationships with Rutledge. And we were excited to pitch the idea to them, and they said yes. It's not that simple, but they were supportive from the beginning. Whitney, hey, you're here, yay. And it's still amazing to think about that dinner and the conversations and the fact that Whitney and I had actually never worked together before then. We barely knew each other, but we knew that there was a need for it, and that this would be a project that many other people would benefit from. And of course, as happens with this type of project, you're like, oh, it was exactly what I needed at the time as well. And we really wanted to think about, like, what is Black feminist sociology? Like, what really makes it unique? What are the guiding principles and theories and methods and practical applications? And realistically, like, what are the risks and rewards, right? And we also had this idea of creating an edited volume that could reflect practices of Black feminist sociology, broadly defined. And what that meant for us is that, we had conversations about how it definitely, for two pre-tenure faculty, would be a lot easier if we just put together a volume just based on sort of coming up with some brainstorming some names of folks we knew who we could be like, hey, could you contribute this volume to this volume? And, it would probably make it less work for us. Because we'd heard stories about edited volumes from people. But we also were like, but how much does that reflect sort of a community praxis? And they said, okay, well, is there a middle ground? And for us, that middle ground was coming up with like a list, a sort of dream team list of people that we would want to contribute, and also having a mix of those folks and having an open call, right? That could go out to whomever, right? And that people could then pitch chapters and that we could go from there. I will say our dream list was like, it was just getting massive and massive. And we were like, okay, well, there's a limited number of chapters you can have. And so we had to do some what felt at the time very brutal cuts, like, okay, only tenured folks. Okay, maybe only full professors. Okay. It was really, it was it's a good problem to have. And it will say pretty much everyone said yes when we asked them, and which we were also in disbelief about. And so when we, with the proposal, which we somehow, we wrote that proposal in about 6 weeks, and discussed some things with the press, and signed our contracts. And for those of you who are on social media, you can see our respective Twitters where we have our toasting champagne virtually. And this was before the pandemic started. So we were virtual because we were, yes, in the same state, but we were in different places. Little did we know how much of our work would be happening via Zoom, right? But it was really important for us to really ground ourselves in what it was we were trying to do, and try to have some of the sort of practices. And that also included sort of mentorship. And I mentioned our amazing editorial assistants who were graduate students at the time and now are full-blown doctors. But also because we thought that was, really important to think about how knowledge about publication is or is not transferred to people, and that we could be part of demystifying the process. Thank you, Ryan, for that time check. And that's my personal time check of 2 minutes. And so it was really about, trying to make sure that we were creating community, that we were being transparent as possible throughout the process, that we were also being sort of expansive in how we thought about Black feminist sociology, and that we were also thinking beyond the US and trying to, and that meant sort of sending out these calls beyond our initial networks and tapping other people and saying, hey, and think about what it would mean to have a slightly more accessible text that could be used in a classroom. And folks have already started using it in the classroom. And also that would have like different ways of presenting Black feminist sociology. So in the volume, yes, there's theoretical pieces, there's data-based pieces, there's letters, right? There's some poetry, right? There's just these different ways of talking about what Black feminist sociology is and can be. And also importantly, not everybody agrees. And in some ways that seems sort of obvious that not everybody would agree, but actually putting that on the page and allowing some chapters, like you'll read some that you're like, are they kind of not an exact opposition, but like they're really, what they're saying here is really challenging what's over here, right? And, we think that's part and parcel to Black feminist sociology. And one of our sort of senior advisors on this who volunteered to help us, Nikki Jones, she and Joyce Bell were critical in this. Nikki really advised us and said like that tension and being able to actually be comfortable and hold that tension is something that Black feminist sociology is great at, because there is that complexity, right, to grapple with, and that it's evolving. And what you see in this volume is out of, well, there were those Dream Team folks, 5 or 6, and we got 80 submissions for the general call. And we read about sort of the process of going through that. And there were still submissions coming in well after the deadline. And I also think it was really important to have these senior advisors, because there were, there's so many topics that, yes, we're familiar with, but also things that we hadn't been thinking about. And thank goodness, one of them said, hey, in looking at the things you've narrowed at, I noticed there actually isn't anything on disability here. And we were like, whoa, didn't even really realize that. And thank goodness my co-panelist is here, right? And it also is reflective of some gaps in sort of where people are thinking about things, right? Because what does it mean that out of 80 plus submissions that came from throughout the world, that almost none of them talked about disability, and certainly not centrally, right? So really thinking about the ways that we think about who is part of a community of who will benefit from Black feminist sociology, right? And that the work is never done. And so we certainly hope that people, get inspired by this volume, but also we expect that some people are going to be like, wait a second, but we would have done things differently. And we say, good. Okay, good. We will literally support you in developing your own volume, because we think there's space for many, and that's really an important part of it. We encourage you to check out our website, and you are welcome to join our email list through the website, so you can keep up to date on the different virtual events we do, and also in-person events, because there's room and there needs to be many voices really pushing forward Black feminist sociology and really pushing forward the discipline. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Luna, for that introduction. Great to the piece and painting that story for us. Next, we will move on to Dr. Shaonta Allen, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Do you guys see this in presentation mode? No, it's
yes.
Yeah.
Presentation mode. We see some notes. Yeah.
1 second. Let me see if I can fix this. Sorry. Let's try this again. Okay, I think now, do you see it in regular mode? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Sorry, let me get my notes over here. Let's try that again. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, hold on, one more time. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and be back at my undergraduate alma mater virtually for this talk. Definitely want to shout out Ryan for all of the work that he's put into coordinating this, and the faculty that have supported that, and also to Zakiya and Whitney for their vision in this edited volume. And it's always cool to hear all of the backstory to it, because as a person who submitted as just a graduate student who has always been passionate about Ida B. Wells and just wanting to write a chapter based on what I would have liked to see in read about Ida B. Wells myself, it's so great to now be a part of this volume, and then to have my chapter like right behind Patricia Hill Collins, who I read very early on in my own training as a sociologist. It's just really great to see how this has all come together. So the title of my chapter is The Black and Feminist Roots of Scholar-Activism, Lessons from Ida B. Wells. And I am excited to kind of go through my visioning for this project. honestly, at the time I was writing this chapter and thinking of this chapter, there was a lot of debates. There's still a lot of debates in our discipline about what is the appropriate way to do sociology. And so when I was looking at the call, there was questions about what does it mean to do Black feminist sociology, and who are the Black feminist sociologists that, the voices that we need to kind of reclaim. And I just felt like Ida B. Wells was the answer to so many of the questions in that call. And so I was thinking about her life and her legacy and the implications that it leaves for us as sociologists today. And this chapter really kind of was birthed out of that. It looks like I went back into regular presentation mode, so I'm just going to say here. For those who may not be familiar with Ida B. Wells and her life and her legacy, she really was an extraordinary woman. She played many roles in society, had many titles throughout her life, including Black feminist, public intellectual, social researcher, Black business owner, wife, and mother. While she did not have a PhD in sociology, I argue that she should be considered a Black feminist sociologist because her foundational research, critical analyses, and scathing critiques of institutionalized inequality have left long-lasting impressions. And so within her legacy, we see lots of nuggets of wisdom for contemporary sociologists interested in producing social research that can inform social change. So throughout my brief comments today, I'm going to go through 4 lessons of contemporary scholar activism that I believe that we can continue to draw on as we do justice-focused research. In our roles as intellectuals, we are distinctly equipped to respond to the enduring issue of inequality. But for some reason, many of our colleagues in sociology remain hesitant to embrace scholar activism as a natural and longstanding byproduct of our discipline. So I hope to rectify this hesitation with the evidence of my case study on Ida B. Wells. So the first lesson that we get from looking throughout major events in her life is to use your body to stand up and speak out against inequality. When she was on a train ride in 1884 back to Memphis, Tennessee, which is where she lived most of her life, she was verbally instructed and physically made to move from the ladies' car of the train to the smokers' car. Even though she had purchased the ticket, the first class ticket, which would have allowed her to sit in the ladies' car, she was deemed not a lady because she was Black. And so she refused, of course, to give up her seat. And the conductor then, of course, physically removed her. She bit his hand in protest, but was dragged out of her seat. Once she did get back home, she sued the railroad company over this incident, this violence and discrimination that she had experienced. And initially, she won her case. Of course, it was later overturned because of the legal precedent that would have set. But in this, we see how she used her body to actually draw attention to the inequality that she was experiencing. Ida B's relentless response signifies how we, as scholar activists today, can use our bodies in creative ways to challenge inequality. By taking her seat in the ladies' train, Ida B. Wells challenged notions of femininity at that time that by definition excluded Black women. Similarly, we should continue to wear our politics on our bodies to dismantle exclusive norms. So what might that look like today? That might be wearing a Black feminist sociology or Cite Black Women t-shirt at a conference. There are ways that we can think about how we can use our bodies intentionally to draw attention to the inequities in our field and in society. Our bodies can be used to complicate the politics of professionalism, and in doing so can create opportunities for change. So we can talk about natural hair, embracing different adornments that have cultural significance. There are ways that we can disrupt the culture of professionalism that perpetuates inequities. So this lesson teaches us that we must continue to disrupt the false dichotomy between emotions and reason as well. Because in some ways, you could look at her incident and her response to the incident on the train as an emotional response. But the tradition of Black sociology and in Black feminist sociology would say, if you are treated wrongly, you should have an emotional response to that. And so in this way, we can see that drawing on our emotional responses is actually an effective tool to challenging inequality as well. The second lesson is use accessible platforms to vocalize subversive opinions in accessible ways. In 1891, Ida B. was employed as a school teacher in Memphis. While in this position, she noted the school district was disproportionately allocating resources to the white schools in the city. And so she wrote about this inequity in her column in the local newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech. And she used that outlet to reveal the institutionalized racism she had observed. However, once this expose had circulated throughout the city, she, of course, was dismissed from her position. And so this incident exemplifies this second lesson, that we have to take advantage of the platforms that are available to us. When penning the whistleblowing article, Ida B. set the precedent for naming inequality that we still employ today. That is to call out inequities when we see them. She additionally emphasized the need for scholar activists to be accessible in both what we say and where we say it. And so this is where we continue to have conversations about, while yes, we know that a part of our job duties is to write academic articles that are often hidden behind paywalled journals. Now we can talk about, what about a companion blog post that may be able to take that research that you were doing in your professional setting, but also so that it can have utility in the public realm. Maybe you might want to create a YouTube blog page, a TikTok, so that way the work that you're doing, the analysis that you are conducting can be useful and legible to people outside of academic settings. Being intentional about accessibility today can look a variety of ways. And so again, we want to draw on social media. We want to draw on our community relationships to make sure that our work is being legible to many different audiences. And another way we might want to use different platforms is the way that we build community in social spaces, and particularly in networking settings, such as like group meets, Facebook groups, Slacks and Discords now. There's so many different ways that we are using these resources to kind of build community. And that's another area and space that we can share our work. The third lesson is to use justice-focused methodologies to empirically measure the social implications of systemic oppression. In 1892, Ida B. learned that her close friends had been lynched. Knowing these friends to have a very they were well respected in the community, the stories that were being perpetrated to justify their lynching just didn't make sense to her. And so this is really what launched her anti-lynching campaign, was the fact that she was grieving her really good friends being lynched and was confused about the lies that were being told about them. And so this bereavement-based curiosity is what evolved into an international anti-lynching campaign that drew on both qualitative and quantitative assessments of racialized violence. As we know, she published many pamphlets that would be equivalent to a journal article or even a book in today's standards. And I even argue that, considering she went to the sites of 750 plus lynchings to get firsthand accounts of these stories, she also has done what I would argue is the first multi-site urban ethnography as well. One autobiography of Wells literally stated that she set out to find the truth by investigating every lynching she could. For months, she culled newspaper accounts, went to the scenes of lynchings, interviewed eyewitnesses. And so this research is not only demonstrative of a multi-site urban ethnography, but it also shows that we should be conducting research in our communities. We should be taking up scholarly interest in topics that are deeply and emotionally connected to the people that we care about and that we interact with on a daily basis. Specifically, Ida teaches us to reconceptualize the knowledge construction process. We must learn to value research topics and the methodological approaches that are necessary to rigorously examine them, even when the broader discipline tries to tell us that they should be neglected. And the final lesson is to create organizations and cultivate spaces where Black experiences are validated and mobilization can occur. Beginning in 1893, Wells-Barnett helped to co-found several prominent organizations, including the National Association of Colored Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Her commitment to fostering unification amongst the Black community exemplifies the final lesson, again, to create organizations or spaces where collective thinking can occur. These organizations encourage radical knowledge production, and that is the exact knowledge that is needed to imagine new solutions to problems. Today, scholars should seek membership in sociological organizations or sections and divisions that allow for their radical thinking to be strengthened. And so we want to take advantage of organizations like the Association of Black Sociologists or the Sociologists for Women in Society, or find sections that you are able to cultivate your identity as a scholar, and also how you want your work to translate academically and in the community. Another approach to this lesson could be creating organizations and new spaces where thinking and community building can occur. And also, of course, again, to draw on the social networking dynamic of building community, as we've seen that within these pandemic times, that's all we've had. And so we've had to use these online and virtual spaces to stay sustained as we navigate these academic and professional locations. And so just to conclude, again, my chapter is ultimately arguing that Ida B. Wells particularly informs our understanding of scholar activism, because throughout her life, she utilized a variety of approaches to demonstrate radical resistance, reach diverse audiences, and emphasize the urgency of social justice work. When I advocate for social justice and scholar activism, of course, I have to note the fact that there was a lot of backlash and consequences to doing this type of work. And so as we think about how we want to incorporate some of these lessons as we navigate the academy today, we should be aware that resistance is resistance because you are pushing up against opposition. And so we have to, keep that in mind, that when we try to draw on these lessons, that it is likely that there might be some resistance to our efforts, but that shouldn't stop us, just as it didn't stop Ida B. Wells. So again, we can use our bodies to stand up and speak out against inequality. We can use accessible platforms to vocalize subversive opinions in accessible ways. We can use justice-focused methodologies to empirically measure the social implications of systemic oppression. And we can create organizations and cultivate spaces where our experiences are validated and additional mobilization can occur. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A, but thanks so much for, again, this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Now we will be moving on to Professor Annamma.
Hi, everyone. Let me see if I can get the screen share going. But Dr. Allen, that was powerful. You're going to just start us off like that. I'm going to have to really get on my toes here. That was beautiful. I'm so glad I got to witness it. Thank you very much. And of course, Professor Luna, we're so lucky to learn about the origins and the intellectual lineage of Black feminist sociology, the book itself. So thank you for sharing that. Let me see if I can get this going. We'll see. Okay, how is this? Is it in presenter view or are you reading my notes? Okay, so I asked two questions. Is it in presenter view? Give me a thumbs up. All right, good. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. I come to you from the lands of the Ramaytush people and give thanks to the learning and community that takes place here. I want to begin by holding space for the lives we lost 10 days apart and remind ourselves that when we theorize, we are not simply doing it for our own interest. We are theorizing our lives and the violence that we are subjected to and what we resist when white supremacy, cis-hetero patriarchy, ableism, rooted in anti-Blackness and settler colonialism are the norm. Okay, if you want, you can join me in taking a deep breath by just putting your feet flat on the floor if that's comfortable to you, sitting up in your chair if that's comfortable and accessible to you. And just on the next inhale, you take a deep inhale to the count of 3. Inhale. Exhale. Thank you. So I want to begin with the words of Audre Lorde, where she says, "Here are the words of some of the women I have been, am being, will come to be." With this quote, Audre Lorde reminds us that we are always evolving. And I think it's the perfect thing to do to engage these words when we're thinking about how Black feminist sociology and disability critical race theory can inform each other. Black feminist sociology, with its foundations in Black feminism, has always been a wellspring of ideas, bringing us closer to liberation from intersecting oppressions. Patricia Hill Collins reminds us that Black feminist sociology has broken down borders between academic disciplines and between the academy and the streets. So I invite Black feminist sociology to consider what meta-frameworks of ours can be revisioned and suggest evolving to include a critical disability studies lens. Meanwhile, disability studies reminds us that disabilities are not simply deficits. Instead, disability is not a problem to be fixed. It's a recognition that all bodies are different, and what matters is what meaning we bring to bear on those differences. But to be clear, disability studies still centers whiteness. So see Chris Bell, 2006, for an academic critique, or the hashtag disability2white originated by Black feminist Melissa Thompson for a public intellectual call out. Consequently, I infuse Black feminist sociology with disability critical race theory. So I'm going to begin by sharing some real world examples of state violence against Black disabled girls considered too intersectional, or what critical race feminist Michelle Goodwin describes as when one possesses a host of bad markers or social characteristics. Often Black disabled girls are just imagined as superhuman and out of control, and this master narrative justifies violence, and yet at times they go unprotected, even by Black feminists and disability studies scholars. I'm going to provide a content warning here because I'm going to talk about this direct violence to elementary age disabled Black girls. Given the last 2 weeks where we've had 2 massacres, one specifically against Black people and the other against mostly brown elementary students, if this feels like too much, I suggest you mute me for the next 8 minutes or so, take a walk or stretch or come back. And when I get to the next slide with an Audre Lorde quote. I'm just pausing in case anyone wants to get up. In September 2019, a 6-year-old Black girl was arrested, handcuffed, and transported via police car to a juvenile detention center. The cause, a tantrum that Kaya threw in school, where she allegedly kicked a teacher after the teacher grabbed her wrist in an attempt to calm her down. After a public outcry, the arresting officer, also a Black man, was eventually fired. State Attorney Aramis Ayala, a Black woman, dropped the charges, stating, "I refuse to play any role in the school to prison pipeline at any age." As scholar Monique Morris has noted, the education system often pushes out Black girls. As you'll see, this is a chart of suspensions you see nationally. This is boys on the left, girls on my right. And what you'll see is white girls are in that turquoise bar there. They're about 2% nationally. Black girls are 12% nationally. So again, we see that we see the consequences for the officer and Ayala's refusal to charge Kaya were reprieve from push out. However, less discussed was that Kaya's disability made her a target for state violence in school. Kaya's grandmother, Marilyn Kirkland, described a conversation with the arresting officer. She said, "Kaya was acting out in class, a side effect due to the lack of sleep because of a medical condition." So he says, "What medical condition?" I said, "You know, she has a sleep disorder, sleep apnea." And he says, "Well, I have sleep apnea, so I don't behave like that." So let's just pause and think about an adult man talking about his own disability and pretending that it impacts him as equally as it does a 6-year-old little girl. Whew. All right. Kirkland's linking Kaya's arrest directly to her disability was a needed intervention, cutting through the narrative of the out of control Black girl. Yet Kirkland, Kaya's grandma, and Kaya's counter narrative was denigrated by the officer himself, but also ignored in many ensuing discussions. So a second example of this, Kaya's story is not unique. Black disabled girls are rarely protected and often punished. So again, this is the chart I already showed you with 12% of Black girls being suspended. However, when you get to girls with disabilities, so same thing, boys on the left, girls on the right, Black girls jump up to almost 20% suspended. So we see that being labeled disabled makes somebody, Black girls, even more in danger of being criminalized in schools than their non-disabled peers. A second example of this, in February 2019, an 11-year-old Black girl in a segregated special education classroom was assaulted by a white male teacher, wherein her braids were ripped from her head. The teacher originally called her out of control, but later a video was released showing the Black girl being thrown to the ground by that teacher. Though the teacher was put on leave and eventually resigned, no charges were filed. Again, to be clear, this is not some uncommon thing. So if you look at this chart here, that somebody disaggregated some data for us, in the district where the 11-year-old Black girl had her braids ripped out, Black disabled elementary students were 6 times more likely, Black disabled middle school students were 27 times more likely, and Black disabled high schoolers were 76 times more likely to be arrested in school than non-Black students. So what we see here is that Black children are often subjected to the superhumanization, which is dehumanizing because they are not imagined as victims. It is important to note that gender does not protect Black girls. That is, beginning as early as 5 years of age, Black girls are more likely to be viewed as behaving and seeming older than their stated age. However, this is further exacerbated as often for Black disabled people, as they are often described as having superhuman strength and are imagined as being naturally, as in their state is always out of control. So being labeled disabled makes you even more likely to be surveilled, labeled, and punished simply for existing because you are imagined as being both superhuman and out of control. Audre Lorde also says, a poem grows out of the poet's experience in particular place in a particular time, and that genius of the poem is to use the textures of that place and time without becoming bound by them. Then the poem becomes an emotional bridge to others who have not shared that experience. The poem evokes its own world. Our goal then, as poets, as writers, and as scholars, is to bridge to others who do not share the same experience. Not all Black feminists are disabled, but Black feminist sociologists can recognize and call out ableism and how it intertwines with racism and misogynoir, uniquely targeting Black girls and women. Black feminist sociologists then can follow Brewer's argument, considering what meta frameworks can be revisioned. Discrete foundation in Black feminism means that the simultaneity of oppression became a central tenet. Consequently, Discrit learned from Black feminist sociology how intersectionality was not about the stacking of identities, but about the ways oppressions converged and manifested in the day-to-day lives of Black girls. I think I'm pretty tight on time here. I don't have my chat up, so I'm just going to wrap it up. So what I want us to remember is that Black girls, focusing on Black disabled girls is necessary because they face material realities. They are overrepresented in school discipline. This is not to rank oppressions compared to non-Black girls, but it's to recognize how ableism lands in lives differently. That is, ableism impacts all Black girls and it hits Black disabled girls the hardest, literally. So the way I want to end is just to simply acknowledge that there are already scholars that have refused the master narrative of being too intersectional. 4 that I want to point out are Terry Pickens, who's been leading the theorizing of the ways of Blackness and disability are constructed. Sammy Shulk, who also was who engaged the social construction of able-mindedness, accepting that able-mindedness is a necessary precursor to having racialized and gendered experiences. And Izetta Mobley and Moya Bailey. So just reminding us that already this work is being done. There are places Black feminist sociologists who are interested in understanding ableism and the ways it intertwines with racism and misogynoir can engage. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Now we will move on to Professor Norwood.
Thank you. I'm at a loss of words. These presentations all collectively were very powerful. I will like to point out before I get started, some of the major themes that in Black feminism has already emerged in these conversations. Themes about belongingness, about naming and self-definition, themes of resistance, building communities, and the ever-present theme of Black women and Black girls being unprotected. So I feel a little overwhelmed. I will speak today on my chapter, which was entitled Black Feminist Sociology and the Politics of Space and Place at the Intersection of Race, Class, Gender, and Sexuality. I'm going to talk mostly about what inspired me to write this chapter, to kind of give you a sense of the concepts and ideas that I was working with and from in this chapter. First, I wrote this chapter to urge sociologists to be more attentive to space and place. Of course, some sociologists are already grappling with space and place, namely urban sociologists, who routinely take up neighborhoods as units of analysis, but also sociologists who are researching health disparities, who use the social health determinants framework, for example, which absolutely emphasizes the importance of environment as a predictor of health and wellness. My own work has been in Cincinnati. I am doing in-depth qualitative interviews for about the last 8 years, over 100 now. I've uncovered layers of violence and what I now term intersecting violence. And by intersecting violence, I'm referring to the intersections of structural, spatial, and direct violence. To make sense of this, I turn to a theory introduced in 1969. He didn't introduce the idea of structural violence. People have been talking about structural violence forever, especially in Black communities. But Johann Galtung introduced the term. He introduced that into the lexicon, the term structural violence, and it's reciprocal direct violence. And then in 1990, he introduced another dimension, which was called cultural violence, right? So in my work in Cincinnati, I discovered that violence was not only happening to women, to the body, direct violence, but it was also happening around them. And so I had to, how do I call this, right? And so I termed this spatial violence. In the neighborhoods that they navigated, violence seemed to be occurring almost daily. Now, references to urban Black neighborhoods as violent is problematic when not contextualized, okay? It cultivates and reinforces stigmas onto neighborhoods without acknowledging the context that these neighborhoods emerge. So urban Black ghettos are deliberate inventions of Jim Crow policy. Hence, I use the term Jim Crow geography. To borrow from the Civil Rights Congress, the CRC, they wrote this petition in 1951 called We Charge Genocide. They refer to these these ghettos, Black ghettos, as spaces born out of violence, deliberately designed to be spaces of destitution, where conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease abounds. The quotidian violence witnessed on the evening news should not be understood as isolated to urban Black ghettos. Sure, violence occurs in these spaces, but it's not isolated to these spaces. The violence we see happening in urban Black ghettos is a microcosm of violence that is happening in the broader American society. In addition to being spatially and socially isolated, ghetto spaces are often hyper surveilled. And there is an abundance both of police presence and police absence. I'm gonna just let that sit, and then I'm gonna move in to more nuance about space and place. So I'm, as you know, rewriting my intro of my book project and looking at new literature. There was a new publication that came out by Fox and Powell in 2021, where they look at places, and they say that places should be understood as assemblages of material meaning built environments, and social elements, right? So they discuss these concepts how these concepts prior exist within a dualist framework, presented as discrete from the other, right? So material versus social. So Fox and Powell introduced the idea of assemblage, which combines material space with social space. They identify space being natural, like the natural environment, material, meaning the built environment, usually three-dimensional. It could be a school, it could be a recreational center, built environment. And then the social, right, where social interaction and social stratification and demographic identities are present, right? So if you can imagine a word bubble, natural, material, and social environment, right? What came to my mind as a person from South Louisiana, the first thing that came to my mind, thinking about those three terms, right, was Katrina, and how we as a society collectively witness the intersection of natural, material, and social environment. First, there was a hurricane, right? So that would be the natural, right? Then there was the breach dams, right? The built environment, which permitted the flooding of predominantly Black segregated neighborhoods. The rooftops, and the Superdome that act as containers for people expelled from their home space. The Superdome, both a refuge, but also a container of torture, given the reports of sexual assault and other bodily harm that took place, the medical neglect, the hunger within that space. And of course, then there was the social environment with their pre-existing stratifications that were present. The neighborhoods that were destroyed by those flooding waters were mostly spaces occupied by low-income Black people, trapped in space. One of the impacts of Katrina was the mass outmigration of Black people from New Orleans. Many displaced people went to Baton Rouge, where I'm from, Houston, Atlanta. Notice I used the word displace. Katrina displacees were referred to as refugees in the news media. And in my opinion, that term was misapplied to Black people who were native born to New Orleans. In referring to them as refugees, it raised the question about belongingness, right? And the fragility of Black citizenship. Again, a central theme in Black feminist thought. I was on a book Zoom meeting with novelist Viet-Thanh Nguyen, who embraces and leans into the label refugee because it has been so unfairly stigmatized. And while I have no disagreement with that point, I did disagree with his critique of Black leaders who pushed against Katrina displacees being referred to as refugees. Nguyen felt that these Black leaders were discontent with Katrina displacees being called refugees because it reflected their own internalized prejudice or stigma associated with the word refugee. As a Black feminist scholar from South Louisiana, I stated in this Zoom meeting my concern with that because the concern was about citizenship, right? So refugees are non-citizens who have been displaced from their homelands and therefore of a different national origin. This was not true of Katrina displacees who were born and raised in New Orleans. We have been there, Black people in Louisiana and Black people generally in the US, but those of us who are of 1619 origin, in most cases, longer than many white people in this country. And yet our citizenship, our belongingness is routinely called into question. And there was a huge outmigration of Blacks from New Orleans following Katrina. Many were permanently displaced. unable to return to New Orleans. Many lost their homes because they were unable to pay the property taxes on their property. And though, you know, Black people were still in New Orleans, it's not like it used to be. So for example, if you go to Bourbon Street, compared to Bourbon Street in the 1990s, it's very different. You can clearly see us physically, not our physical, you can clearly see our absence, not there, right? You can see our absence. But what you also see is the uptake or the appropriation of our culture. The culture itself has been commercialized, Disneyfied by white others who are capitalizing on Black culture in a formerly Black space. This is also an example of spatial violence. And here lies the point, one of the points made in the chapter about space, place, and culture. While culture is indeed tied to and rooted in space, it can also be deterritorialized, meaning that culture can move with persons as they settle into new places. I'm in Washington, D.C. A few months ago, I attended a Mardi Gras parade, a New Orleans Mardi Gras parade in DC. So when we settle into new places, people often bring their culture from other places with them, right? They acclimate, they absorb the new culture, but they also bring in new elements. So I'm going to conclude here and wrap up in saying that the point I tried to make in this chapter and in my ongoing and in my ongoing work is that when we look at intersections, in this case of this example, the natural, the built, the social environments, thinking about Katrina, we might see things we would otherwise not notice. And this is exactly what intersectionality allows us to do. It allows us to see identities not otherwise not seen, not heard, or not known. As you know, intersectionality is a concept that emerged from Black women's lived experiences and Black feminist thought. And it's because, Black women tended to be missing in these movements of, Black liberation movements, white women liberation movements, although we were present in both of these movements and our leadership was often unacknowledged as well as our contributions. We were, as Amy Cox says, or terms, missing in the middle. Again, so what I tried to do was to highlight the importance of adding that lens, space and place in our thinking, in our theorizing, and our understanding and interpreting the lived experiences of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Norwood. We are now going to move on to the Q&A, which I'm sure everyone is so excited for. But before we do that, let's give another round of applause to the panel. Thank you so much for the incredible work that we were able to hear today. I hope everyone on the call that hasn't had an opportunity to dive into the actual text, on the Google Doc, there's a link, or you can Google, I really encourage you to buy it because there's so many other contributors that have such amazing work in there, and it really just puts into conversation so many of these ideas. So just want to highlight that. We're now going to move on to the Q&A. Like I said, what we're going to do is invite students and community members first to ask their questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please put your initials in the chat and then we will call on you. If you're not comfortable with speaking out your question, you're more than welcome to type it and send it in the chat, and myself or another moderator will read it out loud. So first, I'd like to invite again any students or community members on the call to indicate that they have a question, and we can go from there. Thank you all. Don't be shy. We have a wealth of knowledge.
Hopefully someone ask us. I mean, Ryan, you could start by asking us if you wanted to get the ball rolling.
Yes, as a
I mean, you are.
organizer, I should.
You are.
Yeah, I do have a question. I think, oh gosh, I have a lot of questions, but we should go for Professor Annamma. I am doing work in disability studies, and I think it's really, really powerful what you're pointing out, and that sort of the intersection that's going on there. And I think for time-wise, you know, so short. So my question is a little bit more just how do you see with these sort of I don't want to say necessarily a hierarchy of identities, right? But in different spaces, right? People are perceiving identities, some more, right? And especially in disability studies, there's that variety of ones that are seemingly invisible and others that are not, and the ones that people understand and ones that people don't, and sort of such a spectrum there. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how in your studies you navigate the sort of spectrum of disabilities and how that influences that.
Oh, thanks. Now, I would love to hear the other presenters comment on this as well, because for me, you know, so much of understanding disability is about understanding how disability studies has been rooted in whiteness. And it's been an unnamed invisible whiteness that has normed disability studies, which is critiquing the norm, right? And so one of the things that I really, you know, I joke because I'm not a sociologist, but here I am. I'm not a disability studies scholar, but here I am. You know, like I am the interloper in all fields. And I feel like I'm just going, but have you thought of, wait, what about, you know, like I feel like that person, but because for me, it's so much not about identity. I think that's something that we have lost in representational politics is the hyper focus of identity. But if you look at my city right now, we've got London Breed, we've got a Black woman in power, and she just refused to go to Pride because they won't let cops wear their uniforms there. So like, I think we need to talk about how hyper focus on identity has gotten us to representational politics, and how when the Combahee River Collective talked about identity politics, they were not talking about your identity as the way to understand the entire world, right? They were talking about your identity as the root of understanding your experiences with oppression. And to me, that is what intersectionality talks about. It is not a stacking of identities. It is about how oppressions intertwine in our lives. So when I talk about disability, I also want to constantly be talking about ableism. So yes, disability as a political identity is a powerful identity, and I'm not trying to shy away from that. But identity itself is not going to get us to liberation. It is not going to get us to abolition, because it is, for me at least, the intertwining of oppressions that we have to analyze and how those land in our lives differently. So for me, that's a really important piece of this that I always try to come back to. Like I said, I would love to hear what the other scholars have to say, because this panelist is, first of all, so much fire. I just want to, I just spend the whole time, I think my fingers are sore from snapping. But also just, you know, like, as we think about, you know, Ida B. Wells, as we think about place and space, as we think about Black feminist sociology as a whole, right? Like, I don't think it's about identity, because Black feminism isn't an identity politic. Like it does engage identity politics when we're talking about intersectional oppressions. It's not simply about being a Black woman as the only identity that matters.
That's so beautiful. You know, I'm sorry.
Come on.
Yes, I love to have these conversations. So I was thinking for African Americans who have disabilities, if there might be some reluctance to acknowledge that disability because it means taking on another stigma. It also might mean a lack of resources, but of course, acknowledging maybe the disability it could mean that you may be linked to resources or not. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, Professor Norwood. I'm just like, absolutely, absolutely. So like I write about this in the chapter. This is where it's like a 10-minute talk. You just can't do it like all the things. But, you know, I write about how Black folks have disability has been associated with us just by being Black, right? And so if we know that disability is associated with us just by being Black, some of the first things we did is try to unhinge ourselves from that, to untie ourselves from that. Right. And so that contributes to a historical reticence to touch on disability as a political identity. But that's the thing I think is the difference there, is disability as a political identity versus a label somebody else imposes on us. And there is for us, I think some of us are realizing that disability is a political identity that has a history of a lineage of fighting for resistance. So like, do we understand that the 504 sit-ins that are so well publicized to get 504, the law, were supported and run by, in part, Black Panthers and disabled Black Panthers that took on the 504 sit-ins, and that Black Panthers, because there were disabled Black Panthers as a part of the 504 sit-ins, the Black Panthers as a whole supported the 504 sit-ins by bringing food and things like that. But what happens, right, is when that story is told, the Black Panthers are removed. It is all about the white disabled people. And so again, we see how whiteness keeps being the center of disability. And so another reason beyond the historical lineage of using disability as a way to take away our rights, it's also been used as a way to center whiteness. So so that's why a political identity can help us if we get a political education around how disability and Blackness aren't a thing to be afraid of, and in fact, give us our power, then I think we can engage it so much differently. But I absolutely understand the reticence, and it's never to be shamed in our community, as in like, how dare you not identify as such. Instead, it's like, here's why I do, and I would welcome you to learn this history too, so you can see the power in our history.
And I thank you for that. I think also, Subini, you just, you mentioned this briefly, but I think it's so important, because literally listening to a podcast this morning, it was about sort of burnout and the ways that people think about burnout and the relationship between work and productivity and capitalism, and how much like capitalism is predicated on ableism, right? Because it's so much about the idea that your contribution in any capitalist society is based on what you can produce, right? And how much that is based on an assumption, right, about your body and what your body should look like and should not look like, and how it should be able to work and not work, right? And all these different things that are so entwined with understandings of like productivity, that like the idea that capitalism and ableism are so intertwined, people would be like, what do you mean, right? And it's like, no, it is part of an understanding of what it means to be a worker, right? And how important that is, particularly when we think about, and I think this is something that for anyone in the audience who has, whether themselves or aging parents or anything, or as you age, like the reality is your body changes, right? And what does it mean, right? And to be in a category, right, that you will, if you are lucky to live long enough, right, like you will actually potentially, right, most likely to be someone who actually has quote unquote a disability, right?
Right.
And yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. And I would even build on that and say, girl, we need to start talking about long COVID as a disability. We need to start talking about the mass disabling event that just happened, that is still happening to so many. They are now saying 1 in 5 people who got COVID or have long COVID. That is going to change our lives. And that's what I want us to remember, is all of these violent situations and these violent institutions, like prison, not only targets disabled people to pull out of the public and put in prisons, but then it creates disability, right? And so like disability is not something that we get, you know. I just want to be careful and contextual with all of it. And I think your point is so important, is that disability is also created to justify keeping people out of public, right? Like there is really originally something called the ugly laws, right? Like they have lasted a long, there's a lineage of keeping people out of the public, and they want to keep Black folks out of public too. And so Black disabled folks, of course, they're going to come for it first. but Black folks in general, like that's why they're always going to apply ableism to us. And that's why T.L. Lewis is somebody I recommend, and I put their name in the chat along with a number of other, by the way, the first three people are kind of who I would call like public intellectuals: Melissa Thompson, T.L. Lewis, and Imani Barbarin, Black women who, two Black women and a Black non-binary person who all do really powerful work. And then Terry Pickens, Sammy Shelk, and Moya Bailey are the scholars I mentioned earlier. But all of them are, TL has a really great definition of ableism that is built on the concept of anti-Blackness. Like ableism lives within anti-Blackness, like it can't exist without it. And so again, when white folks take it out and make it theirs, they're losing the context of where, now that doesn't mean ableism isn't applied to white disabled people. It's just not rooted there. So again, really thinking about that. And so yes, every comment that's been made so far is, I love it. I love how deeply you're all engaging this.
Thank you so much for the wealth of knowledge here. Thank you so much. Going on to our next question, we have from Franklin Oliver. Where should we start exploring Black feminist sociology besides the book?
Is everywhere. It's across disciplines. That's one of the things I really love about Black feminist literature, is that it can be found almost everywhere and across different disciplines in the academy. And of course, it's, in practice. I mean, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. These are reproductive justice. These are all public acts of public Black feminism. It's around us. It's everywhere. It's mothers in the street. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and one of the, yeah, and I mean, most of the contributors, not all of them, but have other work, right? For some, this actually, that chapter was their first publication, which is also was really fun and exciting for us as co-editors to be able to help people with that process. And people say like, this was such a good experience. I've heard publishing is actually really like negative a lot of times. We're like, well, no, we're trying to support you in this process, actually. We want you to do well. But I also think, on the website, many of these folks are on social media, much more active than I am, to be clear. Our digital editor, Dr. Melissa Brown, who's at Santa Clara University, has a website, blackfeminisms.com, that it emerged in part from some of her work that she had been doing as a student of Patricia Hill Collins's, and thinking about other ways to make Black feminism generally more accessible. And it's an amazing site, a resource. She has her own newsletter. So, and there's just amazing work. It's not only sociology, but just really, amazing nonfiction books that are working in these frameworks. And the way the algorithms work, once you start looking at one thing, one or two, you're going to start getting more and more of them. But yeah, those are some great places to start. Yeah.
I was going to add about that question about where you could start. One thing that you'll notice is if you look at the works that are cited and the references, you will slowly start to do this kind of like reverse genealogy thing. And so as you read various chapters in Black Feminist Soc, you're going to see citations that are going to take you back to, there's chapters in the New Black Sociologists that are talking kind of like, precursory thinking in this Black Feminist Soc way. You're going to get drawn into Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought. You're going to get, drawn to Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde. You're going to get drawn back and back and back. And you're going to see that there really has been a legacy of this thinking. And we're just now at a place where we've articulated it, we've named it. And so now we can really go back and again, do some of that reverse work of really cultivating who has contributed to this conversation over time. So.
The only thing I would add to that, by the way, is I put it in the chat, but I fall in love with y'all. I know, I hope y'all take that as colloquially as I mean it, but I fall in love with being in Black feminist spaces because of the ways we engage our intellectual lineage. Every one of these scholars named names over and over. We cite, we love, I mean, I think that like you cannot be engaged with Black feminist thought without connecting to an intellectual lineage. And so I just want to say how rich it is and how powerful to be in a space where everybody sees that as not just like an add-on, but as like central to our praxis.
Thank you all so much. We have a question from Cassandra Jean for Professor Norwood. Have you considered the impact of climate gentrification as a form of spatial violence in your work?
Thank you. And Cassandra is one of our alumni from Howard. She just started the University of Washington. Thank you, Cassandra. That's a great question. I personally would need some clarity on what is climate change gentrification. It's not something I've encountered in my own work, which again is more kind of urban ethnographic focus in Cincinnati and Black women and sexual and reproductive health. I of course use the example of Katrina because I'm from South Louisiana, and well, climate is it's always, you know, an ever-present thing, given the weather conditions in that very tropical place. But can you give me some insight on what you mean by climate gentrification?
Yeah, I hope my background isn't too loud. I'm in a cafe. First of all, thank you to everyone that spoke earlier. Everything's so impactful. When I was thinking of climate gentrification, just in general, how the climate's been impacting how marginalized groups have been displaced from where they're currently living. So if we're thinking of like a little Haiti and Miami, where the Miami coast is flooding, so now all of the rich people that's been living on the beach are now moving inland and replacing all of the Haitian migrants or those that are there seeking refugee from, 2010 earthquake and all the hurricanes happening there. Those people are now being replaced. And these are people who aren't homeowners, very, very low socioeconomic status. And so we're seeing this happening in like different coastal areas. And so when you brought up Katrina, that's the first thing that popped into my mind, because I do see it as a form of spatial violence, right? The fact that it's still gentrification that's impacting these marginalized groups time and time again, especially considering how the climate is like, worsening as we speak, and now thinking of the intersections and all that thing. So that's what I was thinking of when it came to your research. Yeah.
Right. No, that's a beautiful example, unfortunate, but beautiful example. It's that uprootedness, the removal, right? The expulsion that happens to Black people over and again, in part because we're not meant to be or wanted to be in space. And so our relationship to space is very vulnerable and subject to change through policy and through other means. So yeah, market in this case with gentrification. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's
thank you for that.
yeah.
Dr. Norwood, I had another question I wanted to ask you, building off of the comments you just provided. I love this concept that you talk about space-based culture and how it relates to mobility. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how those concepts can help us understand resistance to the discipline that often attaches itself to Black people in public spaces. And so meaning specifically, like I said in the comment here, how culture is not just something that's contained within a particular space, but it's sort of embodied, right, through our dispositions and our behaviors and sort of even the ways that we navigate the world. And so I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think those are really rich concepts.
So resistance in what way as it relates to culture?
Yeah, I would say, thinking about maybe a contemporary example might be, thinking about diversity initiatives and how there's maybe an expectation for Black people to behave in particular ways in order to be read as legible. But is legibility the end to which, right, we're sort of thinking about, or is there other dynamics that are involved in actually saying, no, I'm centering my humanity, which means I'm not trying to be palatable in this moment, even in spaces that require that. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? So
thinking about Zora Neale Hurston, which I do mention in that chapter, and their eyes were watching God, but just recently also Bone Black, I read recently by Bell Hooks, and thinking of her as a problem child and the expectation of what we're supposed to be and the resistance to, not fitting within a box, right? And so, yeah, no, this is what I think Black feminists do so well, is resist those expectations and push back. And in doing so, redefine what those parameters are for ourselves. And so those are all acts of resistance. I've been thinking a lot about this, being where I am, thinking about Black sociology, for example, something that has been really present in my mind. I recently got a chance to sit down and talk with Joyce Latner, who's still here in the area. And, thinking about how, I think it was on somebody's slides, something about the Black experience. Maybe I wrote it down, but how we understand the Black experience. And it's important that we go as sociologists, that when we're talking about the Black experience, that we also utilize Black social thought for understanding that. And this is kind of what we were talking about here with Cite Black Women and the utilization of a Black feminist social thought to understand the lived experiences of Black people, right? And so that helps us also navigate around and beyond those boxes that people create, right? And gives us room, or we make room, or we create room, again, for self-definition as a means of resisting those expectations.
Thank you so much. Or Jelani, you can say. I think that's all that's, we have one more question. Let's call this the last question we have for Dr. Allen, to hear more about how you came to your work around Ida B. Wells and what pushback you've had.
Thank you for that question. So yeah, it's funny, we were charged as we were in the final editing stage of our chapters to kind of reflect and include kind of a positionality reflection on how we came to our chapters. And so I do open my chapter talking about how I remember specifically learning about Ida B. Wells when I was younger. And the thing that stood out to me was I read this story about her and that interaction, or that assault she experienced on the train. And I immediately thought, I've heard about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, but I've never heard about Ida B. Wells. And I still to this day don't know if Rosa Parks, I know that Rosa Parks's demonstration was, intentional, but I don't know if they were trying to mirror that, if there was any connection, if they were aware. I still have no idea. So Ida B. Wells's great granddaughter actually is a Dartmouth alum. And so I'm hoping to meet her one day and ask her myself. But yeah, so I've always had this fascination with Ida B. Wells. And then I realized as I, went on through my sociology training, my training in ethnic studies and Black studies, that I just didn't hear much about her. And so again, when this call came out, I immediately knew that as I was gonna create a submission, I was gonna focus on Ida B. Wells. And when I mentioned pushback and backlash in my chapter, it was more again to just be, ethically responsible to, if I'm gonna write this chapter and advocate that we put ourselves on the line, we put our bodies on the line, we put our intellectual capabilities on the line in service of justice, that we also need to be realistic that type of work, that type of labor does come with consequences and backlash. And I talk more about that in the chapter, but a good example is Ida B. Wells was contemporaries with W.E.B. Du Bois, but we don't hear much about them together because they didn't get along, because they had radically different approaches to how they did what they did. And so again, that's just one example that there might be tension with colleagues as an example, you know, a backlash to doing this type of work. I haven't faced much backlash in pursuing research on Ida B. Wells. I do plan to continue to write more things about her and her contribution to the discipline. The main question that comes up is, well, she didn't have a PhD. And so I think that we, in sociology, right? And again, when we're in this moment of reclaiming Du Bois and, you know, him having gotten, you know, the first Black person to get a PhD from Harvard, right? We're talking about being situated differently as we reclaim them in this current moment. But you know, I'm going to continue to make this argument that does having a PhD in sociology make you a sociologist? And I think this goes back to the question earlier about who can do Black feminist sociology. You know, and I don't think that's true. We know for a fact we have sociologists working outside of the discipline of sociology and government, all these spaces. Does that mean they're not sociologists? And we know for a fact that we have and collaborate with colleagues across all of these disciplines. And does that mean that they're not doing sociologically rigorous work? I say no, right? I say that they are doing sociologically rigorous work, and that sociology is only enhanced by transdisciplinary efforts. And so I don't think that we can look at, you know, the red record and look at the data that she collected from 752 lynching spots and say that that is not comparative to what sociology is today. So again, I haven't really faced too much backlash, but that's one critique and one question that I get is, why should we consider her a sociologist when she didn't have formal training in sociology? Well, she's showing us that she didn't need formal training in sociology to do extensive and comprehensive sociological research. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. Well, if everyone will join me once again to give a round of applause for our esteemed panel. Thank you so much. I want to invite the panelists to stay on for a few minutes so we can take a photo together. Everyone else who came today, thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you at future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Ooh, y'all are fire. That was fabulous. Thank you so much for including us.
Yay.
That was great.
This was incredible. Thank you.
Thanks,
so
Lottie.
glad
Thank
you've been
you
a
for
part of
being
it.
here.
Yes.
Thanks, Melissa.
Shaonta, I was thinking about, like, man, we got to talk about like academic border patrol. Like, what does it mean?
Literally, when I was like, oh, has anyone else come up with that phrase? I mean,
I mean,
I'm always
you
in
know
this
what I
mode
mean?
of like,
Just like
that phrase. I'm like, oh.